Well, this aid is hugely important. And as you mentioned, it was stuck in the House for months and months. And it was causing all kinds of issues for Ukraine, not knowing whether or not this aid would come. In the meantime, Russia has made some important advances, taking the town of Avdiivka, taking other different areas in the east, in the Donbass region of Ukraine, and being able to put a lot of pressure on Ukraine. They are spending way more. The Russians are spending way more than Ukraine is on its military, well over 2 to 1. Russian military spending as a percentage of its GDP is some 7.5%. And they just keep conscripting more and more men. Putin doesn't seem to have a problem with conscripting a lot of young men that are not from Moscow, not from St. Petersburg. So many people in the cities don't end up hearing about this. And so they've had an advantage, and this has been really difficult for Ukraine, who is running out of artillery in particular. So Russia has been outshelling Ukraine by like almost 10 to 1, and the Ukrainians have had to shell just sort of these ghost shells just to kind of scare the Russians. So what this will do is it will at least stop the advance of the Russians. It's at least going to create some kind of stalemate. And that's something that they haven't been able to achieve since they attempted that counteroffensive. They've been losing a lot of ground lately. And the hope is that this can stop some of the Russian advances, particularly in the east.
Yeah. You know, Mike Johnson, the Speaker, who really made history by, you know, a group of Republicans siding with Democrats, and he may face the wrath of his party still. He said he was taken through the security risks, and that's what persuaded him to support this bill. What do you think he might have learnt that might have helped him change his mind?
Well, traditionally, Republicans have always been a party that has been in favor of huge levels of spending, military spending, but in particular supporting allies using military spending to do so. So this is very much unheard of in U.S. politics, to have the Republicans to not be on board with this type of military aid. And so I would think that if Mike Johnson, we don't know that much about him, but he's a traditional Republican, that his own viewpoints are probably in line with this. And that this wasn't a stretch for him, and that probably some of this additional information about how dangerous it was to leave the Ukrainians on their own, and how far Russia would advance, and how this would threaten NATO allies, and of course poses a threat to the U.S. I think all these things kind of came to play, but it's really this very strange situation, this far right flank of the Republican Party, which has become so extreme, where we don't even have bipartisanship on foreign aid packages, which, like, again, as I mentioned, is completely unheard of. And it was tied up to some sort of immigration bill. Just shows how polarized U.S. politics has come. I think in any other year, you wouldn't have seen any problem trying to convince the Speaker of the House, whether they're Republican or Democrat, to provide this type of aid to Ukraine.
Yeah, and as you point out, being the election year and it's so contentious. Europe, too, has made commitments to Ukraine. Part of the problem is some of this is not coming through quickly enough. How critical is it that Europe is also there as the backstop to keep propping up Ukraine, given as well, to your point, Russia is not going to stop pouring money into this campaign?
No, it's definitely important that Europe also steps up, and I know that many European leaders have said as much. NATO countries need to continue to spend 2 to 3% of their GDP on the military, many countries which are not doing that yet. I know that the Baltic countries, fearing an possible invasion from Russia, are definitely doing so. And then other bigger European countries are talking about providing more support for Ukraine, particularly military support. Ukraine is in desperate need, as I mentioned, for shells and artillery, but longer range missiles, armored vehicles, air defense systems. These are all areas of weakness and vulnerability for Ukraine, and the U.S. can't supply it all on its own. And you're right, there are several several issues. I mean, getting the U.S. aid over there also does take time, but on the European front, there are a lot of bureaucratic hurdles that make this very difficult to get it to the Ukrainians quickly. So we won't see much of a change in what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine for weeks, if not months. It will take some time, but I think it does help morale if both Europe and the U.S. appear to be completely committed and on board to supporting the Ukrainians.
Yeah. Russia has been targeting Ukraine energy infrastructure. They did that at the start of the war. Are they doing anything different? How effective has this strategy been?
No, they are continuing to target the energy infrastructure, and that's one of the things that the Ukrainians were pleading for more air defense systems because they were going to need to be able to block these types of attacks from the Russians. This will become more of a concern as the summer goes on, and then we start getting towards the fall and the winter months, where they're concerned that the Ukrainians are concerned that how are we going to survive the winter if there isn't electricity, if these types of targets are hit by Russians. And Russia's gaining all kinds of support from both from Iran and allegedly from North Korea. And so they have a lot of sources of support, and it seems like an endless supply of weapons. And they also have an advantage in that sense. And so the Ukrainians are constantly on the defense. And I think that was one of the reasons why Zelensky was pleading with U.S. and European allies for some of these air defense systems.
Yeah. It was interesting, too, to see that part of this bill, that if once it gets through Congress in the U.S., also allows for the transfer of confiscated Russian assets to Kiev to finance reconstruction, possibly supported in other ways. Do you think that's an important thing too?
Yeah, I do think it is important, but I think those were aspects of the bill that some of the Republicans were hoping for. They're concerned that there's been almost like a blank check given to Ukraine. They're worried about some elements of fiscal responsibility and ensuring that the Russians pay to some extent for the cost of this conflict. So there are a lot of aspects of the bill that became really important. And it's also critical to note that the way that the bill actually passed in the House, at least, is that Mike Johnson, the Speaker, had to divide the bill into 4 different types or sections. One just for the Ukraine-Russia conflict, one for the Taiwan, and then, of course, another one for Israel. That then enabled them to zero in on what was going on in Ukraine and to bring in some of these other details that would satisfy some of the holdouts in the Republican Party.
Yeah, really interesting to see how he managed to pull that off, but we'll see how it plays out. Natasha, really appreciate your analysis as always. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.